And in the deepest throes of depression, it is still my great joy to introduce our guest today, Professor Seth Masket, Director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver, currently working on his second book, visiting Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I didn't know you were working on another book. Is it Learning from Loss 2? Because apparently we still have some shit to learn.
Oh, this is sort of my sequel to my Democratic book, Learning from Loss. I've been interviewing and surveying Republican county chairs all across the country to get a sense of how they were thinking about things starting back in early 2023, and that's the basis for a lot of this book. So the book is kind of two things. One is it's a specific focus on the Republican nomination in 2024, the decision to nominate Donald Trump a third time in a row. But it's also about changes in the party over the last roughly 30 years, the sort of rise of the populist right that took over the Republican Party from being a very fringe movement with Pat Buchanan as its leader back in the early 90s to becoming like the major dominant group within the Republican Party, and how it kind of turned that party into a place that Donald Trump would recognize as home before he even got interested in politics. And part of that is sort of never rethinking your losses, never rethinking your mission. And like I'm getting into it there, and I don't know if I have a great answer for it yet, but like the way that Democrats and Republicans interpret election losses are vastly different. That, Democrats are always convinced that whatever they've just done or whoever made it was the complete wrong thing to do. And they want to rethink everything and change how they nominate people. And Republicans take losses as either, recently we don't acknowledge it, but like other times it's more like, well, that was a fluke. That was a weird year. There's no reason to rethink everything. Let's just do the same thing, only spend a little more money. And these totally different strategies seem to have fairly similar track records, weirdly enough. I don't know that either of them is right or wrong. They're both defensible historically, but they lead to very different behavior.
Well, let's talk about the election that just concluded. What the hell happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. All right. So here's my take. That I'm thinking about this sort of internationally here. What we've seen in kind of the post-COVID world, economies all over the country, democracies all over the country, is just this sort of general grumpiness over inflation and the lingering effects of inflation, higher prices, higher interest rates, a lot of just sort of dislocation related to the economy. And we've seen in democracies all over the world, ruling parties, majority parties taking a hit. In a lot of places, that's meant, the majority party losing power. We saw just recently in Japan, the Labour Democratic Party just lost its majority for the first time in a really long time.
Same thing in the UK, right, where the Tories got wiped out. Yeah,
Tories just lost in the UK. The majority party retained power in France, but only very narrowly. The U.S. is not immune to this. I mean, the U.S. has had a more successful economic recovery than almost any other place, but still with similar levels of anger from voters. And we keep seeing this in poll after poll, people saying this country's off on the wrong track. I don't care that inflation has come back down. I'm still paying more than I was a few years ago. I still don't like the way things are going. And, and that was the environment. That's an environment that really strongly favors an out party. And all the things that Donald Trump did were simply not disqualifying. And that's also a pattern that we've seen in election after election.
Feels like a tall order. You wrote on your excellent Substack, Tusk, which we get a lot of our followers on Substack from you, so thanks for the recommendation. But you wrote this great piece called Taking It In, where you partially argue this. The question is, did Donald Trump win the election, or did the Republican candidate win the election? Like, if it was Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, do you expect the same dynamics would have taken place, or is that, too dumb a question to ask?
No, it's a really good question. Honestly, it's good because we can't answer it, but it's my impression, and I had written a piece similar on this a few weeks ago, that if you look at just sort of how grumpy voters are, how dissatisfied voters are, that's actually consistent with pretty substantial landslides against the majority party.
Right.
And my intuition candidate would have actually been, done quite a bit better against the Democrats this time around. That Nikki Haley would have done better. Now it's hard to conjure up what that world looks like, because if Nikki Haley had somehow won in the primaries, Donald Trump would have shit on her all throughout the year, and so
Right.
you have a very different election than that.
Right.
But just if Trump somehow dies a year ago, is replaced by Ron DeSantis or Haley or something like that, I assume that candidate does a lot better actually than Trump did this week, just because there's less baggage, they're make fewer enemies, less overtly racist.
Well, you wrote also in your Substack that you thought Kamala Harris ran what you thought was a virtually flawless campaign. Can you elaborate on that and why it didn't matter?
Yeah, and I'd be curious to hear you guys' take on this as people who know campaigns. But as I saw it, well, I mean, it was a shorter campaign than we usually. But she ran very strongly. She raised over $1 billion and spent it in a very short period of time. She had as far as I could tell, a really top-notch turnout organization. She absolutely decimated her opponent in the one debate they had. She gave a number of really strong speeches and did well in interviews. I'd say her rhetorical approach was somewhat conservative, and I mean, I don't mean that in like a anti-democratic way, but I thought it was a really strong and very well executed campaign, and it basically didn't matter. And importantly, she was running against a really disorganized shit show of a campaign that she had massively outspent. And that was just sort of experimenting with different turnout models all the time, and in which they were constantly apologizing for their speakers, and Trump was going off on tangents. They spent the last before the election talking about a squirrel that had been killed in New York. Like
I blame the squirrel.
These are none of the you do to win a campaign, and I just don't think I have a hard time picking up what were the campaign effects here. Pretty modest at best. I just don't think this mattered all that much.
For practitioners, I think there's a real question about, like, do campaigns matter at that level? I would argue that a state house field operation still matters a lot if a state house race is going to be close. I would argue that a congressional level field operation could still matter if that election is close, but I'm not convinced at the moment. I think we need to reevaluate the entire toolbox of tactics and figure out what works or not. There was one line in the Atlantic piece that Tim Alberta wrote before the end of the race here where he said, every time a Democratic mailer hit a mailbox, this one Republican consultant that was working with Trumpland cracked up because he's like, these fucking guys are still living in the Stone Age. And I'm like, yes, but all of our research tells us that mail still works, and it's got a 5% net effect on the outcome of an election, blah, blah. But I do wonder if that is magnified down ballot and just evaporates at the top of the ticket because elections are so nationalized and candidates become so well-defined and that kind of thing. I mean, I also wonder from a field perspective, I was a field guy my whole career. I started thinking about this the other day, and I'm sure plenty of people, and I'm sure there's been reports written on this already, but the Ring doorbell camera effect, we used to knock on doors and nobody fucking knew who was standing there. Now everybody knows it's some schmuck with a clipboard who wants to talk with them about politics. So,
oh yeah, that may be having a similar effect to caller ID with polling and everything like that. That just people you can avoid the contacts you don't want to have.
I also wonder if I've thought a lot about the fact that Kamala talked about prosecuting the case against Donald Trump. In retrospect, there's that old yarn that doesn't matter what you say, just spell my name right, about, getting media coverage. I almost wonder if talking about Trump at all was the wrong approach.
I know we might have different viewpoints on this. I don't think that if she had changed her how she talked about Trump, or if she'd mentioned the economy slightly more, this and that, I don't think it changes very much at all. But I also don't think that of course she was going to talk about it, because in every election he runs in, he's the number one issue. He's like the number one turnout issue for both Republicans and Democrats. So I think, in some ways, I think it would be silly to not talk about him, since that's what, voters are going to be focusing on anyway. And among the people she was trying to reach, he was deeply unpopular. I don't know that was a bad call. But yeah, you
You
know,
also
if she,
can't
yeah,
avoid it. Like you just can't.
right,
He is, and it's probably part of the sauce that gets him elected. But you
yeah,
can't avoid. He dominates the headlines. Maybe it's because of the circus freak carnival barker thing. Maybe it's because the media is addicted to him and can't help themselves. Like maybe it's because we as human beings are just drawn to the spectacle.
Well, he's
Like, I think
interesting, you know.
it's and horrifying, but it's not
Yeah.
boring.
yeah. Well, this was an analysis I did that's going to be part of my book. So here's a teaser. But I was looking at the coverage of the different Republican presidential candidates back in prior to the primaries and caucuses. The coverage on Fox News. So like on Fox News, like when they were talking about presidential candidates, what percentage of the time Trump? And it jumps around a bit from week to week, but on average, 70% of the time they were talking about Donald Trump. And that was even in weeks when there were presidential debates that he did not participate in. So like even when it was DeSantis versus Haley versus Christie and everyone else, the story was about how Donald Trump didn't participate. So like you could call that a media addiction or something like that, but they also know, well, yeah, if we talk about him, people will read the story or they'll click
Right.
on this, and he's good for ink. We know this. Yeah.
I guess I want to dive a little bit further into that. Like again, like we're doing counterfactual morning after Monday morning quarterbacking, or I guess Thursday morning quarterbacking. So like
Yeah.
this is all speculation, but like, do we just need a bigger personality now? Like Kamala Harris was fucking incredible. Like I was at the DNC, I got to meet her. Like I thought she not just ran a flawless operational campaign, I thought she was a historically good candidate, and in a way that Donald Trump is a historically bad candidate. And because she didn't suck up all the oxygen, because she wasn't doing outlandish and outrageous things, and she was disciplined, and she was playing by a smart book, or a book that looked smart at the time, I suppose we can say now. Like, do we just need to like find a fucking like, you know, celebrity and run them? Is it The Rock? Like, what's the answer here? Because I mean, hopefully, probably Donald Trump's going to like not be able to run again because Constitution and all that stuff. But I think we're all question marking that too. But like, do you really think that like the personality aspect of this needs to happen, or is Donald Trump just a unique, aberrant creature?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear your thoughts on Harris as a really strong candidate. I mean, that was my impression as
It's
well.
obviously true. Like,
yeah, but I was it always sort of, and I sometimes to my students this, it brings me back to when I was taking driver's ed when I was 15, and the one thing I remember, that the one lesson that I took with me was you can do everything right and still have an accident. um, and yeah, you can have, it's possible to have, I mean, some people, and I'm going to be fighting with people like this till I die, just insist that any candidate who loses is by definition bad. And that's simply not the case, right? I mean, she could really have done everything right, and there was just no way a Democrat was going to win this time. But so I guess the question is, do Democrats, and God help me for my sins, I'm probably going to end up writing this book, you know, this learning from loss 2 thing and figuring out how the Democrats think about this going forward. But like, who do they try to run? Should they be planning to run against Donald Trump for an unconstitutional and illegal 3rd term in office? I don't even know how you plan that.
great.
Or should just they be thinking about, well, you know, who's likely to succeed him? And I don't even know what that looks like. But it's, in some ways, he's like such a singular personality. Like Republicans were always trying to figure out, oh, this Obama guy's really good. What do we do? How do we take him down? And they didn't. And then he just left office. So I don't know if Democrats need to be rethinking everything. The fact that, you know, Hillary Clinton beat him in the popular vote, you know, and Biden beat him in the popular and electoral college. Do they actually need to come up with a new model, or is it just that they need to be running in conditions that are more favorable to them? And it's possible in 2028 that the economy is still not great, not what people want. That it looks, you know, and that's something where people want to throw the ruling party out of power, as has happened the last 3 elections in a row. But obviously you want to be thinking about things you can actually have some control over. And yeah, I certainly wouldn't advise them to just go on randomly in with a celebrity, because that can cause you to give up. As we saw with Republicans, it can cause you to simply give up on a lot of things that you used to care about. But also, I don't know that it's necessarily a losing formula either.
So running for president is basically running for student council at this point.
Just find the popular kid?
Yeah, that's all it is. You also mentioned in your Substack that Trump benefited from quote-unquote overt bigotry. What do you mean by that?
I mean, my take on this, and this is what I wrote a little bit in there. I'll go into the weeds here just a tad. There was there's a political scientist named Tali Mendelberg who wrote this book about 20 years ago about essentially like coded racism in presidential rhetoric. And one she focuses on specifically was George H.W. Bush, so Bush Sr.'s campaign against Mike Dukakis in 1988. Talks about like the use of the Willie Horton ads and basically using a fairly coded set of things, like talking about safety, talking about crime, of sort of getting at racism without overtly saying it. And it was working for a little while. It was turning people away from the Democratic ticket and toward the Republicans until essentially a lot of journalists and the Democrats started pointing out, this is actually pretty racist what you guys are doing. And once that became the sort of dominant story that these were racial appeals, they lost a lot of their effectiveness because a lot of voters and a lot of journalists have this kind of norm that you're actually not supposed to do that. And that
so they
was,
didn't
I think,
stop doing it. They just lost
Right.
their effectiveness. Is that the
right?
argument? Okay.
Yes, it stopped moving people in the. I mean, it was enough that Bush still won, but they lost a lot of the movement there. And I think that was kind of the model in politics for a while. That there's lots of things you can do to activate racial resentment in voters, but you can't be too overt with it because people notice that and they react badly to it. Trump essentially flipped that on its head. And I think based very wisely on his experiences in 2016 and 2020, reasoned there's basically nothing I can do that will cost me the support of moderate Republicans. They will complain about it. They'll say, I wish he wouldn't say those things. But in the end, they will still prefer me over whoever the Democrat is. And they'll still show up and vote.
And all the Liz Cheney fucking chat sessions in the world apparently didn't seem to undo that.
Yeah, I mean, there were like hundreds of prominent Republicans who came out and endorsed Kamala Harris and said, you had like Trump's own chief of staff saying this guy's a Hitler quoting fascist. I don't know that there were any prominent Democrats endorsing Trump, but that the breakdown is just if you look at the exit polls, like essentially 95% of Democrats voted for Harris, 5% of Republicans voted for Trump. It did not make a difference. So yeah, Trump seems to be gambling that he can lean into pretty overt racist stuff. And first of all, he's not going to lose the Republicans in the middle. And it might actually excite some of the people out in the wings to show vote for him where they might not have otherwise. And I think that strategy has really paid off. I think you could have made the argument in previous campaigns that he's trying to run sort of a regular Republican campaign and occasionally accidentally let some racism in. I think this time it was more deliberate, particularly that the rally.
Like he accidentally let some normal stuff in?
Yeah. Yeah. Where they were just leaning at speaker after speaker, insulting Puerto Ricans, insulting women, conspiracy theories about immigrants. And they say, oh, we didn't mean to be quite that racist. Now, you did. And did it, at the very least, it did not prove toxic. And quite possibly it got them more of a vote. So we're in that world. How do Democrats respond to that? I have no freaking idea.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not like we can just say like, all right, I guess we'll be racist now. Like that's certainly like morally bankrupt and stupid, but like also like won't work for our coalition, like just on a practical basis.
Democrats could start insulting rural whites the way Republicans insist that Democrats have been. I don't necessarily recommend that either, but like,
I had the same thought, but again, like feels stupid and wrong, and also is not something I would ever do just because I don't think that's a good way to be a person. But you keep saying like the truth here, which it's fucking deeply unfortunate and horrible, and I want to like throw up about it, but like. You say, like, it is not dumb to do this because it produces an electoral win. And, like, I'm having a hard time grappling with that, but I also can't argue with it.
I guess one of the bigger questions here is like, how should we be thinking about Trump as a really singular figure here, right? Would this work for another candidate? And yeah, I think we've seen evidence of a number of other Republican candidates who have tried his style and it does not work as well.
Right.
Lauren Boebert is only still in Congress because she jumped to a safer district.
100% true. Obviously true. Yes.
Yeah. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is only there because she's in a very safe district. You know, some candidates who have tried his stuff, it does not work, and voters get angry. So like, there's the combination of either his style or the fact that he was, you know, a 40-year household name or whatever branding he managed to do on The Apprentice for more than a decade. That like this gives him some connection with voters that is not alienating the way it might be with a different candidate.
What do you make of the fact that it looks like roughly 17.5 million people who voted in 2020 just didn't vote in 2024?
Is it that many? Okay,
yeah, it's that many right now, and there's still outstanding ballots. California takes for fucking ever to count. It will tick up, but it won't tick up 17 million. It probably won't tick up 7 million. So let's call it 10. That's gigantic.
Right. I think, yeah, and that's one of the things I'm wrestling with right now. I think that's less a story about 2024 than it is about 2020. Which was a really unusual political environment. You have, you've got COVID, right? So basically, a lot of people are at home. A lot of the distractions they would usually have, sports and other things and work, just not as present. So people are paying more attention just for starters. And the stakes of the election seem really high. But also, you have like a summer of these George Floyd protests that were very politically engaging for people in both directions.
Right.
So people just, that's something particularly that engaged the youth vote in a huge way, engaged the minority vote. And that's a really hard model to sustain. It's hard to think that, people looked at this and didn't think politics was really relevant to them, considering everything going on in the world. But I think it's really hard to replicate that 2020 environment. Like I think I'd written something back in 2020 about how politics is through sports, because like people have literally nothing else to root for. Right. And sports had sort of started up, but only in a weird way. That fortunately is a world that won't come up again anytime soon. But it was a weird year.
So. One of the many things we were wrong about last week before the election proved us to be stupid idiots was this theory that we had that, like, since, Josh Stein running for governor in North Carolina was, like, crushing Mark Robinson in the polls and Ruben Gallego in Arizona was crushing Kari Lake in the polls, that there was, like, not going to be, like, that many split-ticket voters and therefore, like, Kamala would win because under the surface there were these aberrant, abhorrent creatures like Robinson and Kari Lake. I was right about the fact of the matter, which is that split ticket voting is down. I was wrong that it wouldn't hurt Donald Trump and it would help him instead somehow, right? Like Kari Lake might win this fucking Senate race in Arizona. She's only 2 points down and they only have 70% of the ballots counted as of this recording. The North Carolina governor's race, Josh Stein won handily, and Mark Robinson was, like, particularly strange. So, like, to your point, they didn't want, like, that guy who called himself a black Nazi on, like, porn sites, I guess. Like, there's a disqualifying line somewhere there. But, like, the Donald Trump form of dog bullhorn racism seemed okay. What do you make of election results in a state like North Carolina that voted? And even Jeff Jackson, the Democrat, is currently winning the attorney general's race in that state as well, while Robinson is badly losing the governor's race. So what do you make of split tickets like that when Kamala did not do well in North Carolina at the end of the day?
Yeah. That was my impression going into it was that people are more than capable. Like, yeah, split ticket voting is down historically, but that people are still capable of it once in a while. So like the fact that you had like these really toxic, alienating Republicans in a few races, either Republicans just simply, they might vote for the Democrat, they might just simply skip that ballot line. But they would still, for the president, they would still show up. They still wanted to do that one. I think that would be different in a midterm year or something like that, but they were never not going to show up for Donald Trump, even in states that weren't all that competitive. So I think people were capable of making that jump. It's also interesting to think about, like, what if one of these folks, what if Kerry, the presidential nominee, right? What if Donald Trump had called himself a black Nazi or something like that?
He may as well have shit.
Honestly, right? Yeah, yeah. We might not uncovered that one yet. But like, would that something that here, I'll back up a second. Thinking about, and I always come back to this, 2010 in Colorado, Dan, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, who, like, the Republican Party could not move more quickly to distance themselves from,
right.
and just like said, this guy who's our nominee, he's totally not our nominee. We're backing Tom Tancredo.
Yeah, but then they nominated Tom Tancredo, essentially, who was like actually worse.
Okay, fine, but like they were willing to toss their own nominee under the bus to split the party's vote, and they were just like, we're not going to rally behind this guy for governor. They were willing to take a hit at the level of governor, even though they did really well across the board in the other races.
Right.
And I think we've seen that they will take a hit in some races, but not for president. That no matter that the president's, and that maybe that's just a function of national politics being so important today, or that's the way Trump campaigns or whatever, but just like the presidency is so important, they will simply back whoever has the R next to the name.
Let's shift briefly to our state, presidential aside. What's the lesson from what Colorado did?
I don't know. I mean, it's the state. Look, I mean, I guess it's slight Republican swing, but only very slight. Otherwise, it still looks like a very bright blue spot on this map.
Can you explain why you're saying that? Because I've heard that from others. Like, a reporter called me on election night and tried to make that argument, and I was like, I have no fucking idea what you're talking about. We swept everything. There's not a single legislative Republican from Colorado Springs as of this recording. Not one.
I was only sorry. My thinking was only looking at the presidential vote, which I thought Biden won by 13. It looks like she's probably going to win by 11 or so.
Yeah, I see. That was not a well thought out question. I meant other stuff. Sorry.
Yeah, but in terms of did that slight shift affect any elections? No. Like, Democrats basically, as you point out, basically swept everything. This is still it's a very blue place. It's, voting like California or Massachusetts, more or less. And it was interesting to see the initiatives that won or lost, but basic, the things that were liberal Democratic priorities did very well. And so this state is blue enough that it seems immune from that. Now, I am sort of curious. We'll see this years to come. Like, this substantial, 10 years ago, this was considered a toss-up state.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it swung very hard left in the Trump era. In the same way that Florida swung hard right and Ohio swung hard right. And I'm curious, like, at some point, Donald Trump will no longer be in charge. What will the state look like then? But even in midterm years, like, Jared Polis is winning by double-digit margins. This looks to be a safe place for Democrats for the foreseeable future.
Republicans haven't won a statewide race since 2014. Ian will correct me and say Colorado, CU Regent, but I don't count that. So.
Yeah, like, Cory Gardner was the last competitive statewide Republican who won an election and will be the last one for the foreseeable future. I want to drill down on one last question on something you just said, though. Is every election just a reaction election now? Like it really feels to me like, if I thought this, there was a molecule of this thought before the votes came in on Tuesday, but like, I was like, if Trump wins, then it really is just backlash to the backlash this point forward, right? Like, as a political scientist, like, are we just in cyclical elections now? Like, does it really matter? Or do we think that, like, we can return back to, like, a typical United States competitive map at some point, hopefully after Trump is sort of gone?
Yeah, the last three presidential elections, 2016, 20, and 24, like, they've all been these environments that really work against the incumbent party. 2016, Democrats had already been there for 2 terms. Mm-hmm. It was mediocre economic growth at that point. 2020, of course, you have COVID and this crazy economy. 2024, you have like this post-COVID inflation and everyone's angry. Like these are all circumstances where incumbent parties get tossed out, and that's exactly what happened in those elections. And now it's coming after a year, after an era of remarkable stability, where you had three successive two-term presidencies of alternating parties in a row, which is like I think the first time since like Madison was in the White House. So like, yeah, we had like this weird norm where incumbents generally win re-election and there's a little stability, and now it's just like not even every 4 years, every 2 years, there's just like this massive, people are just angry and throwing out the ruling party. Well, that makes policy sort of hard to figure out, right? And, and it means, most of what presidents do in their first 2 years is, undo whatever their predecessor just did. Like that's the whole agenda.
Right.
Is I'm going to create Obamacare, I'm going to undo Obamacare, I'm going to strengthen Obamacare, I'm going to undo Obamacare. This is just what we're doing. There are smarter minds than I who, looking at things like this is about economic dislocation. This is about an unstable middle class that, is just because of economic inequality, they will never be satisfied. They demand things of presidents they simply cannot. And so maybe we're just there for the foreseeable future, but it's a lot of tumult, and it's a lot of vitriol. At least so far, it's not particularly violent, but man, it's unsettling.
Not particularly violent.
That's my good thing today. U.S. politics, not particularly violent.
I'll give you the opportunity to leave us with something even more optimistic. What? Like my brain immediately spit out yesterday morning. We're recording this on Thursday, so in the cold light of the we lost, waking up and looking at the map, Pennsylvania getting called, that was the end of that. I was like, all right, well, 2026 is going to be lit for the blue team. Like that's what I mean. Are we automatically heading into a version of 2018, a version of 2022, where we know that we're going to be able to capture energy on either the buyer's remorse side when Trump gets in there, and I mean there's Republicans admitting Project 2025 was really the agenda the whole time kind of shit, or is something else going on, and who even knows anymore?
Yeah, and do I need to hibernate every 2 years?
I mean, obviously it's hard to know the economy and other things going on, but just guessing with what we can know today, I think we still don't know who's going to control the U.S. House, but whoever will, it will be pretty narrow. So if Republicans get it, that could be very easily in play next time around. I'm not sure about the Senate map, but what you're going to have, some of the things we know, there's going to be all sorts of constitutional crises under Trump. He may be sentenced in a felony case in a few weeks, and then there'll be conflict over whether he can fire that or whatever. There's going to be a crisis there. Obviously, one of his initial priorities is, can I deport 10 to 20 million people? And there's going to be massive resistance to that. That may seem like it did on the election. It will not be a popular move. It will be disruptive. So, I can easily envision lots of crises over the next 2 years and people being even angrier. And that just easily paves the path to, a Democratic takeover of one or both chambers, and then more impeachments, and then on and on.
I know I'm exhausted by just hearing you say it. So
I know. Yeah.
Any final words of wisdom? I mean, this is not unlike the primary prediction pod we did with you after the 22 midterms, where we were just wrong about everything, so it felt kind of sad. But then ever since we've had you on the show, it has been relatively celebratory around here because Democrats tend to do well in Colorado, especially, but in these reaction to Trump.
So you're saying
elections.
it's Seth's fault?
It's probably me, but yeah. I mean, it is. There's a couple of things we haven't talked about. Is I think what mostly the story of this election is, we're talking about a big a nationwide shift, right? Yeah. It's not about appeals to very specific voters. Although we did see big shifts in the Latino population, and did not see that in the black population. And that's interesting. And there was maybe some effect of Dobbs, but not huge.
Right.
And so just sort of figuring out like what stuff seemed to work and what didn't, and why some parts of the population moved and some didn't. Like there's a lot to sort through here. And also like what sort of candidate would work for that in the future. I have no idea. But we have a lot of new evidence, and I don't want to put you guys out of business, but I'm not sure campaigns are. I don't know what they're doing.
No, I do think, like, I've never worked on a presidential election as like a paid staffer. Probably never will. Have no interest in that.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. I hear they pay well, but yeah.
Yeah, right. Because that's why I'm in politics and not investment banking. But like, I have to believe that campaigns matter the lower on the ballot you go.
Yes,
right. And
I totally agree.
And like looking at like HD 50 in Colorado, like Mary Young is within 60 votes right now, and like that's not determinative because Democrats are going to have a supermajority in the state house here no matter what happens in that one seat. But like, whether or not 20 other people took a packet to a door or made a couple phone calls will matter at the end of the day in that election. And the further you get up the ballot, I think the more diluted it gets. And that might be some interesting political science to do. And maybe you'll do it and come back and tell us about it. So Seth Masket, otherwise known as SMOUTS, besides your excellent Substack Tusk, like the elephant, where can people find you on the internet these days? You're still off Elon's hell site, yeah?
Still off Elon's hell site. You can find me on Blue Sky. You can also listen to my podcast with political consultant John Hagner. It's Power and Flower, wherever excellent podcasts are sold. And otherwise, just look me up at sethmasket.com.
All right. Well, the SMOUTS himself, Seth Masket, professor of everything, professor of the pod. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. Enjoy your sabbatical. We look forward to we'll have you back on when the book comes out. Sound good?
Thank you. Always a delight talking to you guys. I really appreciate the work you're doing.
All right. Stay safe out there, man. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.